Hello, saints and scholars. Welcome back to Theolife, where today we're getting stuck into the who, what, why, where, and when of 2nd and 3rd John. Let's start off with why. 2nd and 3rd John are kind of interesting letters. First off, they're super tiny. Depending on the translation, they often will compete with Jude for the shortest books in the New Testament. They're almost the exact same size, which would lead some people to believe that they were written possibly on the same piece of paper. So they likely came together. But why did they come together? Well, it's because 1st John is probably not a letter, but is in fact a sermon. It's full of rhetorical device, and it definitely reads more like a sermon. So it's possible that John writes his sermon, and this is what 1st John is, and then he gives 2 personal letters to go with his sermon. 2nd and 3rd John are very much written in the Greco-Roman style of a letter. It's possible 2nd John was written as a letter to the general church to be read before the congregation prior to the leader of the church reading the sermon, and 3rd John is a letter to an individual within the church, likely the church leader, to give them more specific details not intended for the audience at large. So it's likely 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are a complete package, with John being the sermon, 2nd John being the intro letter for the congregation, and 3rd John being the specific letter for the leader who is supposed to get this information. Now let's talk about where. Who was the audience for these letters? In all likelihood, the letters were carried by John's friend Demetrius, and John may have been requesting Gaius to host and welcome Demetrius on his behalf. To whom were these letters written? First, let's look at 2nd John.
To the lady chosen by God, and to her children, whom I love in the truth.
So, who is this lady? Let's look at 3 options. Option number 1, the lady could be a personal friend of John who we know nothing about. John may have just had a special friendship, possibly a familial relationship with a person at the church, and this letter could be addressed to that lady. But history, I'm afraid, has long forgotten her identity. It's possible that the terms lady and chosen were the first name for the intended audience. The term lady being the Greek term kaidia, and the term chosen being electe, could possibly be first names for someone to whom Paul was writing. Yet we just don't have evidence that these names were ever actually used as names in the 1st century. Theory number 3, chosen lady could be a sobriquet for the Christian church. The terms lady and chosen were names the church definitely used to define themselves. The term chosen is actually the same Greek word as the word for elect, so when it talks about the elected ones or Christians being chosen by God, it's often a term just used to define Christians in general. The Greek word for church, ekklesia, is a feminine word, and there are some images within early Christianity where the church was defined as a woman or a lady. Some people believe Revelation 12, which speaks about the woman giving birth, is an image of the church. John also refers to the children of the lady, and this could possibly be referring to the congregation. In numerous occasions throughout the letters of John, we see him use the word children to define the congregation. At the end of 2nd John, he refers to the lady's sister, and we do know that early Christians referred to the relationship between churches as that of sisterhood. But to whom was 3rd John written?
The elder, to my dear friend Gaius, whom I love in the truth.
This is distinct as it is written to a specific person, and the word Gaius doesn't have other meanings other than the name. So who is Gaius? Well, Gaius is likely a leader within the early church. Now, we do read about a Gaius in other parts of scripture, particularly in Acts 19.
We read in Acts 19 that after Paul's preaching on idolatry, the crowd is whipped up into such a frenzy that they start a riot. We read that 2 of Paul's companions are caught by the rioters, one of them being named Gaius.
It is possible that this Gaius and the Gaius who's addressed in 3rd John may be the same person. Church tradition tells us that John was writing to churches in Ephesus, and this riot took place in Ephesus. Definitely possible that it could be the same person. The only caveat being is Gaius was a very common name in the 1st century world. In fact, there are several Gaiuses spoken of in the scriptures. So, to whom were 2nd and 3rd John addressed? You decide. So, Who wrote 2nd and 3rd John? This one gets a little bit more complicated. To begin, the letter is anonymous, which would be similar to all of John's writings, and they are defined as antilegomena by Eusebius in his classification of New Testament books. This is likely because early on some theologians disputed if 2nd and 3rd John were written by the Apostle John. Yet, upon close examination of the Gospel of John, the letter of 1st John, and 2nd and 3rd John, we are going to see a terrific amount of crossover.
We see in the Gospel of John the word truth is used 23 times, the highest amount in the New Testament. In the Epistle of John, the word truth is used 10 times, making it the second highest usage, and in the tiny letters of 2nd and 3rd John, the words truth also play a prominent role. Another of John's favorite terms is the word beginning. The Gospel of John has the word beginning 7 times, which is the highest in the New Testament, joint highest with the letter 1st John, and then appears twice in 2nd John, which is significant for such a tiny letter. Finally, the unique Johannine phrase new commandment only appears in the writings of John, in his Gospel, and in 1st and 2nd John. The other wonderfully unique Johannine phrase Antichrist only makes an appearance in the letters of John.
We also note that 2nd and 3rd John are addressing the Gnostic heresy just as 1st John was doing. Finally, 2nd and 3rd John have a highly personal tone where they very much are speaking to someone whom they know very well. This means that the author was likely very well acquainted with the church to whom they were speaking. Much like the letter of 1st John, we really have to look at the Gospel of John and the letters of John as one complete theological package. The letters of John are not like the letters of Paul and Peter, like 1st and 2nd Peter or 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Those letters were written to address different situations, possibly a year or two apart, and were distinct in their own way. In all likelihood, the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John arrived at the church in one package. So when we're trying to do something like determine the date or the author of 2nd and 3rd John, the best thing to do is to look at evidence for the date and author of John's Gospel and 1st John and kind of lump them together. So who wrote it and when was it written? You decide. Let's end today with a review.
2nd and 3rd John are unique letters in that they were likely accompanying 1st John. 1st John was probably written as a sermon that was to be read to the entire congregation. 2nd John was a cover letter to the sermon for the church, and 3rd John being a personal letter to the leader of the church. 2nd John is addressed to a lady chosen by God, yet the identity of the lady is still disputed. This could be a personal friend of the Apostle John. The term lady or chosen could be personal names, or it could be a sobriquet for the entire church. 3rd John is addressed to Gaius, who was likely the leader of the church to which the letters were sent. There are several Gaiuses referenced in the scripture, and it could be one of those people. 1st John and 2nd and 3rd John have very different styles, which have led some to conclude that they were written by different authors. But when we look at the text itself, we note that they are different genres, 1st John being a sermon and 2nd and 3rd John being personal letters. Also, we note that throughout the letters of John and the Gospels, there is a terrific amount of uniquely shared words that only appear in the writings of John. Thank you for joining us on Theolife. May God be with you.